Good evening and welcome to Mining the Riches of the Parsha. Tonight is Thursday night, January 11th, 2024. The Ramban, Nachmonides, in his commentary to the Torah, writes a short introduction to each of the 5 books of the Torah. And in his introduction to the book of Shmot, Exodus, we're now in the second portion of the book of Shmot. This week we read the Torah portion, VaEira. So the Ramban lays out that the entire book of Shmot, the second book of the Torah, is the model for Jewish history. And that model is the progression from Galus, exile, to Geula, redemption. The book starts out with the Jews as slaves in exile in Egypt, persecuted, and then leads to Exodus, to freedom, to being able to connect with God and being on the way to Israel. That is the structure of the book as a book. And of course, it's also the content. That's the narrative. That's the subject matter, the book of Exodus. And we see this theme repeated at the very end of last week's Torah portion. So you remember, God gives Moshe this mission to go to Paro, to lead the Jews out of Egypt. And God sends Moshe to Paro. Moshe and Aaron go to Paro. Let my people go free that they can serve God. And Paro's response is, Tichpad ho'avoda, nirpim heim, right? You have too much empty time on your hands. You obviously need more work. Stop this foolish discussion about leaving and freedom. And instead of actually leading towards Exodus, it actually gets worse. The burden on the Jewish people becomes more harsh. And the Torah says at the very end of last week's Torah portion, Vayoshav Moshe el Hashem, Vayomar. And Moshe comes back to God and he says, Hashem, lama hariosa lama zeh? Lama zeh shlachtani? Why have you made it worse? You sent me to try to help, but actually it's gotten worse. Umeos basi el paro ledaber bishmecha. And now that I've gone to Paro to speak in your name, Heira la'am hazeh. It's made things worse for our people. V'hatzel lo hitzalta es amecha. And you certainly have not done anything to save your people. It's the opposite. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, and God says to Moshe, Ata sireh, now you will see, Asher ese leparo, what I am about to do to Paro. Ki biyad chazaka yishalchem, ubiyad chazaka yigarshem mi'artzo. Because with a strong hand I will send you out of Egypt. With a strong hand you will exit and leave the land of your oppression. Okay, so it's a little bit like you're watching a series on Netflix, and at the end of each episode, it's like a cliffhanger. Everything looks like it's getting worse, and then you have to wait till next week. But this back and forth at the end of last week's Torah portion is not just a literary tool for increasing the drama and the suspense. We're all waiting to see, okay, so now what's going to happen? And we see it start to unfold in this week's Torah portion, VaEira. But in fact, this is the theme of the entire book. And again, it is the model of Jewish history over and over and over again. The Ramban writes that this historical pattern is so important that the Torah inculcates it into our daily life in many, many ways. Just to give a couple of examples. our calendar follows the cycles of the moon. Yes, corrected by the solar calendar, but we follow the cycles of the moon. Why? Why follow a lunar calendar rather than a solar calendar? Well, near the beginning of each Jewish month, near the beginning of each lunar cycle, on Motzei Shabbos, Saturday night, we go outside and we say Kiddush Levana, the sanctification, the blessing of sanctification of the new moon. And in that prayer we say the following words: V'lalvana amar shetischadesh ateres tiferes lamuse beten shehem asidin lischades kamosha. We say to the moon that God ordained that you, the moon, will be renewed, because the moon appears to us to get smaller and smaller and smaller, and then it actually disappears from sight, from visible sight from Earth for a certain number of hours, and then it reappears as the smallest crescent, and then it grows and grows and grows. And we say that the cycle of the moon is the parallel to our own history. And just like the moon at the moment at the beginning is very, very small, so too we, when we are in exile, when we are persecuted. But we look forward to growth. We look forward to the moon becoming full. We look forward to our redemption. And we have, therefore, with the way that we mark our time, this constant collective reminder. Every day, every holiday, we have this pattern. And this, by the way, is the first mitzvah, the first commandment that is commanded to the entire Jewish people through Moshe. We're going to see this in next week's Torah portion, the Parsha Bo, that we follow the lunar calendar, so that we always, constantly have this reminder of this format, this structure that exile leads to redemption. This is the mitzvah by which we arrange our lives, by which we mark time. On an individual basis, just to take one other example, we have a mitzvah of nida and tevila, mikvah. A married couple, when a woman gets her period, there is a separation between husband and wife. There is a certain type of exile, of distancing. And then a certain amount of time passes, and this woman is able to go to the mikvah, and there is a reunion. There is a coming back together. Again, this pattern of exile and then redemption. But it's not just that nida is followed by mikvah. It's not just that redemption, that exile is followed by redemption. Rather, the Talmud says, for example, concerning the mitzvah of nida, the reason for the separation, according to the Talmud, between husband and wife during the time that the wife is a nida, the reason for that separation is in order to enhance and increase the joy of the reuniting. That is, exile necessarily precedes redemption. Exile, more than that, contains the seeds of the redemption which will follow. So why is this the pattern that God repeatedly establishes for us in individual commandments, in communal commandments? Why do we have this theme, this structure over and over and over again? We've discussed in the past, and let's review it very briefly, one of the great personalities, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria. He lived in the 1500s. His family was originally from Spain, and his family was expelled in the Spanish expulsion of Jews in 1492. His family moved across the Mediterranean going eastward, and he lived in Tzfat, in the northern part of Israel. He's known to us as Arizal. He died at the age of 38. And he was the most important scholar and teacher in the subject of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, in the last 2,000 years. And the Arizal grappled with the greatest issue of his day, the expulsion of Jews from Spain. Understand, please, that for the Jews in that generation, the expulsion of Jews from Spain and then later Portugal was as massive a catastrophe as the destruction of the temple, as the Holocaust. It was that order of magnitude. And so the question was, how did such a thing happen? How could God allow such a thing to happen? So there was a traditional response put forth by many, encapsulated in the words of the prayer that we say on Yom Tov in Musaf. Mibnei chato'enu galinu mi'artzenu, because of our sins we have been exiled from our land. We committed sins, and exile is the punishment for the sins that we have committed. Applied to this scenario, Spanish Jewry at that time, according to this line of reasoning, was more acculturated, more assimilated than other Jewish communities at that time. And therefore, because of their many sins, this terrible catastrophe happened. Now, that is a very, very problematic approach. It's important to deal with it, but it's extremely problematic. We've discussed this before. We'll leave that discussion for another time. But the Arizal had a different answer to this question. And he began his answer with asking a very daring question, which is actually based on some earlier sources, but he is the one who is most closely identified with this analysis. And the question starts as follows. How could God create the world? If God is everywhere, Malo kol haaretz kvodo, the entire world, the entire earth, the entire universe is filled with God's presence, where was there room to create man and the universe? If God's everywhere, where is there room for the physical world, for us? And so the Arizal answered that question with a concept called Midas ha-Tzimtzum, the characteristic of Tzimtzum, to retract, to retreat. In other words, God had to exile himself, retreat into himself, so to speak, in order to create the space where the world could then be created by God. God first had to make room for something other than God and then fill that void. In other words, the first act of God's creation of the world was an act of retraction, retreat, exile. And this gives us a new reading of the first verse in the Torah. Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim es haaretz. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. V'haaretz haisa sahu vavo. And the earth was filled with a void and emptiness. Now, usually we understand that second phrase, the earth was filled with void and emptiness, that's a description. That's a description of the way it was. But according to the Arizal, no. Bereshis bara Elokim, the first thing that God created was Shamayim v'aretz v'ha'aretz haisaso vavo. The void and the chaos and the emptiness was the first creation. Only once God had created tohu vavohu, only when God had retreated, then the next step, the second creation, would be the world and the universe and the animals and human beings and everything else. So that's the process. And I'm oversimplifying because this is just a brief explanation of it. But that is the process by which God created the world. And therefore, since this is an aspect of God's nature, so to speak, this is how God created the world, and our highest goal is to imitate God. Therefore, this principle was established by God as the pattern of Jewish history. We see the same thing happening over and over and over again. Exile leading to redemption. Exile leading to redemption. Persecution leading to flourishing. Retreat leading to creation. Over and over and over again. And so that we don't miss that, God builds that pattern into our daily lives in so many ways. Communally, in terms of our calendar, as we mentioned. Ritually, for example, the mitzvah of Nida that we described before. It also becomes the key to morality. Sometimes I need to step back to make room for you. That becomes the foundation of morality. I need to retreat sometimes in order to make space for you. I've shared this with you before. The line that we say at the end of Kaddish and the end of the Amidah, Oseh Shalom Bimramav, God who makes peace in the heavens, Hu Yaser Shalom Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael, you should make peace among us and among all Israel. That famous line, we ask God to make peace. We end every prayer with a request for God to make peace. You'll notice, before we say that line, whether it's the Amidah or Kaddish, we take 3 steps back. Why do we take 3 steps back before we say that line? One answer that is given by a number of commentators. You want peace? Sometimes you got to step back. You have to make room for the other person. You have to retreat. You have to put yourself a little bit, sometimes, in exile in order to leave space for the other person in order to achieve peace. So this pattern is pervasive and it's omnipresent. Now, I want to be very clear. This does not mean that exile is not bitter. And this does not mean that the darkness is worth it because it leads to light. This is not a discussion about reward and punishment at all. It means that crisis and chaos contain the seeds of peace and reconciliation. Egypt, slavery, exile, persecution led to Sinai, the closest intimacy that we've ever achieved with God. Building a Mishkan, a sanctuary. Coming to the land of Israel. The expulsion from Spain was followed by an amazing flourishing of Jewish life in the northern part of Israel, Tzfat. The Arizal is one of those amazing figures there. And it also was followed by the growth, tremendous growth of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. That all happened after the expulsion from Spain. And there are many, many other examples in our national lives and in our individual lives. So that explains why Mitzrayim, why Egypt, why Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim, we do something as a reminder for having exited Egypt. That becomes such a major part of the Torah. So many mitzvos, so many of the behaviors we have, not only the holidays, but individual commandments that we have, are connected to this because it connects us to this pattern of God that is intrinsic to our own lives. And also it gives us a way to view the world, to view history, and individually to view the events in our own life. And this is the significance of observing Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh is the beginning of the new lunar cycle. This past day, Thursday, Wednesday night and Thursday, was Rosh Chodesh Shvat, the first day of the Jewish month of Shvat. Tonight begins the second day. We are now in the second day of the Jewish month of Shvat. And as I mentioned before, we observe Rosh Chodesh, we follow the cycles of the moon because our history and our own experiences follow this pattern. Disappearing, but then growth. Exile, but then redemption. Darkness, but then abundant life. It's interesting, this morning in our prayers, we added a prayer, which we do every Rosh Chodesh, the prayer of Hallel. Now, the prayer of Hallel is a series of passages from Psalms that we say on Yom Tov. Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkos. It's a song of celebration. It's a prayer of celebration. Okay, well, I can understand why we're celebrating on the holidays, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkos. I understand. But why say this same prayer on Rosh Chodesh? I mean, what are we celebrating? It's just a scheduling day. Because today is Rosh Chodesh, that means in 2 weeks it'll be Tu B'Shvat, the 15th of Shvat. We know when the next holiday is. We know when we're going to celebrate again. But Rosh Chodesh is just the day that helps us keep track of it. Why do we say the prayers of celebration today? Rabbi Yisroel Reisman explains something fascinating. The Talmud tells us that as long as the temple was standing in Jerusalem, there was no Hallel recited on Rosh Chodesh. The idea, the practice of reciting Hallel on Rosh Chodesh only begins when the Jewish people are exiled with the destruction of the temple. Because Rosh Chodesh gives us an insight in how to see joy even in exile. Rosh Chodesh is the new moon just after it has disappeared in its smallest phase. The least amount is visible to us, but it holds the promise of redemption, of fullness. Even if at this moment we're in the darkness, but Rosh Chodesh promises us there will soon be abundant light. The full moon is promised to us specifically at the moment it disappears. And so we say Hallel on Rosh Chodesh because in exile, it is Rosh Chodesh that teaches us how to be able to celebrate, even in the midst of darkness. In last week's Torah portion, the Parsha of Shmot, when God gives this mission to Moshe to lead the Jewish people, Moshe finally agrees, and he gathers his wife and his 2 sons, and he takes leave from his father-in-law Yisro. And Yisro gives Moshe a blessing. Lech l'shalom, go in peace. That's what Yisro says to Moshe. Now, actually, the literal translation of the words that Yisro says, Lech l'shalom, is go to peace. And the Talmud points out the difference, very, very subtle, between Lech l'shalom, go to peace, which is what we say to someone when we take leave of them, when we say goodbye to them, and a different phrase, Lech b'shalom, go in peace. And the Talmud says that second statement is only appropriate when a person has passed away. We say to the soul of that person, Lech b'shalom, go in peace. What's the difference? Go to peace or go in peace? Rabbi Avraham Kook, the first chief rabbi of Israel, explains that life is filled with struggles, all kinds of struggles. If we're saying goodbye to our fellow, we don't do them a favor by pretending that there will be no struggles along the way. And therefore, we warn our friend at the beginning of their journey, you should know that there will be bumps along the way. There will be obstacles. There will be challenges. So we say to our friend, Lech l'shalom, go towards peace, go to peace, meaning proceed toward your destination, but don't expect that it's going to be easy. The road is filled with impediments, with potholes. For someone who has passed away, the situation, of course, is very different. That person has completed their journey here on earth, and their struggles are over. The obstacles no longer exist for them. And in that situation, we say, Lech b'shalom, go in peace. You are now at peace. You are now at rest. Your struggles are over. Your journey in this world has ended. Lech b'shalom. But even in this world, the pattern of Exodus shows us that the challenges and the obstacles we face contain the seeds of redemption and harmony. And this was eloquently stated by the Kotzk Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kotzk, the great Hasidic leader. He once said, 3 ways are open to a person who is in sorrow. One who stands on a normal rung weeps. One who stands higher is silent. But one who stands at the top converts sorrow into song. Rosh Chodesh and Exodus ask us to stand at the top, to convert sorrow into song. There is a famous musician in Israel, a rock star in Israel, Aviv Gefen. You may know his music, you may have heard him. So Tal Lesser, a woman who lives in Israel, recalled that years and years ago, when Gefen would be giving a concert in a concert hall, in an amphitheater, he would shout out at his concert, "Do you want change? Do you want change?" The truth is that for most of us, the answer is no. No, not really. I really prefer things the way they are, thank you. We're comfortable with what we know, with what we're used to. This mode of life, of staying the same, of being comfortable with the way things are, of being afraid of change, this is represented symbolically by Mitzrayim, by Egypt. Egypt was the symbol of stability and permanence. Everything happened the same. The Nile always flowed, whether there was rain or was not rain. Slavery was a part of life that everyone expected. The dynasty of the Pharaohs existed from time immemorial and would always continue to exist. And even after Pharaoh died, each of them was mummified so they'd be preserved forever. Mitzrayim represents it stays the same. No change. There's an incredible new edition of the Torah published by Koren, which includes commentary from areas of academics that help us to better understand what the Torah is saying. So it includes the insights of historians, of archaeologists, other experts to help deepen our understanding of the Torah. So listen to this insight. It's incredible. In this week's Torah portion, we have the pasuk. The verse says, God says, Vir beisi es ososai, ves mofsai, be'eretz Mitzrayim. I will increase my signs and my wonders in the land of Israel, God says. Now, James Hoffmeyer understands that what is going to happen, and we see it beginning in our Torah portion, is something that is beyond nature, something extraordinary by definition. But Hoffmeyer points out that what we see in our Torah portion is not just this clash, this competition, so to speak, between God, between the plagues that God brings and the Egyptian gods and their, in quotation mark, ability to do the same. But a very essential aspect of God's wonders and signs in the plagues is directed specifically against Paro, and specifically against Paro in his role as the person who is charged with maintaining Maat. Now, Maat is an Egyptian word. It's very hard to translate exactly, but it is a fundamental concept that academics have taught us about life in ancient Egypt. It means the social order. It means the way that things continue on a regular basis. It confers and conveys the unchanging nature of life and society. Ma'at. Ma'at is the Nile that always provides water. Ma'at is the sun that always rises every morning. And Paro, as the sovereign of this empire, is the person who represents that Ma'at. The main duty of Paro is to maintain Ma'at. And therefore, if it's the Paro's responsibility, therefore Paro takes credit when the Nile provides its water to irrigate the fields, which it happens regularly and predictably, Paro takes credit for it because he's the person in charge of maintaining Maat. Keep things as they are. Nature goes on. No changes. Everything stays the same. But then, when nature starts to become unpredictable, when the plagues come and the Nile no longer gives water but blood, when the earth no longer produces fertile crops but lice, when the sun does not rise in the morning but instead there is darkness, then it is Paro who is held responsible, because this is a disturbance and a disruption of Ma'at that Paro is responsible for. So when God brings these makos, the plagues that begin in our Torah portion, yes, of course, they cause grievous suffering to the people, but they are also an attack on the personality of Paro. Under this Paro's watch, Ma'at collapses. And so what God is saying, not only to the Jewish people, but to the entire world, is that the world does not run on the principles of Ma'at. The world runs on God's principles. The result of the makos, of the plagues, was it undermined the idea of existential stability. Because think about this for a moment. There are other ways God could have persuaded, forced the Egyptians to let the Jews go free. By choosing to change nature, it shows that the purpose was to upset our stability, our sense of permanence, our sense that everything continues the way it always has. That's the way it's always been, and that's the way it always will be. But the Exodus from Egypt disrupts that. It says not only to the Jewish people, but to the entire world, that it's possible to break through. It's possible to change. It's possible to overcome the apparently permanent laws of nature. They're not permanent. They can be changed. They can be upended. There is the possibility, which had never before been considered under this concept of Maat, there's the possibility to change reality. This is God's world order. Another way to put this, it's possible to do teshuvah. It's possible to repent, to be a different kind of a person. Just because I've been one way for a long time, it doesn't mean I have to stay that way. I can change. And so, when Aviv Gefen yells at a concert, "Do you want change?" You know, we may be accustomed to this idea that we are faithful to tradition. We keep things the same, and yet that's really not true. The foundation of our identity as a Jewish people is a struggle against nature, a struggle against routine, a perpetual striving for change. That is who we are. That is what we stand for. That is what we bring to the world. A sense of being a revolutionary, a sense that, yes, things can change. And when we do that, we are presenting precisely a rejection of ancient Egypt. and rejection of its worldview of Maat. Allow me to share one more piece with you tonight. Perhaps the most poignant, heartbreaking persecution of the Jews in Egypt was Paro's decree in last week's Torah portion, Kol haben hayilud hayaora tashlichuhu. Every male child that is born must be cast into the river and drowned. God forbid. So many parents mourning the loss of a newborn child, it's unimaginable. And the truth is, even when it is not due to a monstrous decree, the loss of a baby late in pregnancy or just after birth is heartbreaking. It's traumatic. I want to share with you briefly this evening a monumental transition in Jewish law over the last 30 or 40 years. And I will share with you, with my wife's permission, our story. About 37 years ago, we lost a baby boy late in pregnancy. And we did what the experts at that time told us to do. And as Orthodox Jews, we did what our rabbis at that time told us to do. After our baby was delivered, we declined to hold our baby or even to see our baby or to take a photo or a footprint. The Jewish funeral home, we were living in New Orleans at that time, the Jewish funeral home took care of all the arrangements for us. There was a symbolic bris, which is an ancient Jewish custom, long-standing Jewish custom. We did not attend that ceremony. Our baby was buried in a Jewish cemetery. There was no funeral. We were not present. No monument was placed on his grave, though we were told the location, and later we did visit. The funeral home was kind and sympathetic and helpful. Based again on ancient Jewish tradition, we gave our baby a name, though without any ceremony. We named our baby Rachamim, which means mercy. We have a baby named Rachamim. We did not sit Shiva or say Kaddish, as the experts and our rabbis told us, so that we could move on. And we did. We healed with time, with our children, though the depth and length of our pain was far greater than we recognized until much, much later. And I am sure that even today, we underestimate the impact of this traumatic event in our lives. Now, eventually, over time, I learned more about this subject from experts who were giving very different advice, and from rabbis who explain things differently. And since that time, about 37 years ago, I have had the heartbreaking privilege to guide couples going through this in a very different way than we did. Hopefully, by sharing this with you tonight, others will understand and perhaps act differently than we did all those years ago. It is hard for me to think of another example where the consensus of opinion in authoritative Jewish law has changed as much in so short a time. But here's what we learned. We spend so much time and effort and money and emotional energy trying to avoid pain, to move on. Don't think about it. Don't talk about it. Move on. Put it behind you. But here's the truth. The only way to the other side of pain is through it. And the other truth is that everyone grieves in their own way. There is no right or wrong way. There is only the way that is right for me, the way that is right for you. So even today, all these years later, there are many religious Jews who read and hear from their rabbis and practice what we did all those years ago. And for some, this may be right for them. But everyone deserves to know that there are options. There has been a monumental shift in how many apply Jewish law to this subject today. I have come to see that what we did, what we were told, is a misreading of our classical Jewish sources, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many authorities in Jewish law today. Because the practices that we avoided are not actually prohibited according to Jewish law. They are simply not demanded. They're not required. And that's precisely because our rabbis understand that at this vulnerable, liminal moment, different couples need different expressions, different modes, different outlets. And Jewish law offers that understanding and that flexibility. Since our own loss, when a couple suffers, God forbid, a late miscarriage or stillbirth or the passing of a newborn, I encourage considering options. I tried to provide the wisdom of Jewish law and practice to support those options. I encourage couples, if they want, to hold their baby, to talk to him or her, to take photos, mementos, to connect to the name they give her or him. I encourage couples, if they want, to attend and participate in the burial, again, if they want, if they can. And to consider, if they want, to ask select others to join them. And to consider, if they want, sharing or hearing words of prayer, Torah, to elevate and sanctify this tragic transition. I encourage, if couples want, to place a monument at the grave and to visit. I encourage making use of the forms of Shiva and Kaddish in a way that is comfortable for each person. Parents in this situation have the flexibility to design and choose how they will mourn from the toolbox that Jewish law provides. So even if Shiva is not required, it is available for someone who wants to stay home and reflect, or to be surrounded and supported by close friends and family. Kaddish is not required, but it is available. It's permissible to make use of this opportunity to be enveloped in the warmth of a minyan saying this prayer together, to connect more deeply with God, who mourns with us. It is important that we as a community never pass judgment on how a couple navigates this terrible loss. And with rare exception, we should not offer unsolicited advice. It is crucial that couples going through this have access to rabbis and to sources that support making use of all of the helpful tools that our tradition can offer in a way that works for them. 37 years ago, I did not have a rabbi like that. But I became that, along with more and more sensitive rabbis and other professionals today who, with halakhic expertise and profound sensitivity and experience, who learn from the best that psychologists and researchers can teach us, and who can integrate all of that in a way that is uniquely meaningful for each couple. We cannot remove pain, but we can try to guide through it to the other side. My friends, I wish you a beautiful evening and a great Shabbos. And I look forward to seeing you all soon in person.